Mafia: The Old Country has impressed ever since it was revealed last year. Trailers suggested top-of-the-line graphics powered by Unreal Engine 5 in one of its first major deployments in an open-world title. But now that we have the final game in hand, does it live up to those beautiful cinematics? And are consoles capable of delivering a similar visual experience at a good performance level? Mafia: The Old Country is often stunning. It's really the core mix of Unreal Engine 5 technologies that makes the visual presentation work. Lumen is the star of the show here, per usual, draping crevices in shade and scattering light around corners. In the game's early 20th century towns, you can expect to see a rich portrayal of light, as it bounces through spaces and illuminates the game world. Considering the scope of the game and the level of lighting fidelity that's been achieved here, Lumen is a perfect fit. Mafia is set in an era before the widespread adoption of glass and synthetic materials, so it's really the diffuse GI component of Lumen that's important here. The quality mode on PS5 does include Lumen reflections as well, which basically adds a perspective-correct fallback for SSR on most glossy surfaces. These reflections do reveal some limitations of the game's Lumen technique, namely that it's using software Lumen instead of its more expensive triangle-based hardware variant. The game uses blobby, approximate SDFs to trace against, which doesn't include skinned objects like characters, relying solely on SSR. A triangle-based technique would provide more accurate diffuse and specular GI, but hardware Lumen doesn't appear to be in the game at all. Virtual shadow maps give the game a sense of shadowing consistency that really sells its open-world bona fides. Shadows look near perfect from most perspectives, falling off realistically as the shadow grows further from its casting object, and appear artifact-free. Some details like these blades of grass rely on screen space shadows, but VSMs are used for most geometry. The game's virtualized geometry system, Nanite, also helps realize a coherent open world. Pop-in is kept to an absolute minimum here, with the visible pop-in only occurring at far distances when models appear for the first time or when H-LODs are replaced. Otherwise, models appear consistent from hundreds of meters away, right to point-blank distance. Mafia is using Unreal Engine 5.4.4 according to the PC files, which means Nanite is properly supported for the game's foliage. Most Unreal Engine 5 games so far haven't attempted a true open world, and Mafia is probably the best showcase we have of how UE5 can support an open world vision. There's a level of quality and consistency that other engines would struggle to meet with this kind of scope. It's helpful that the game excels artistically as well. The depiction of turn-of-the-century Sicilian society just feels pitch perfect, and you never really find any asset that feels out of place or low quality. That's despite clocking in at a mere 40 gigabytes on PS5, presumably aided there by not having to include lots of pre-calculated lighting data or low-detail LODs. The game also packs a healthy amount of cutscenes. These sequences are visually striking, with a heavy focus on detailed metahuman-based characters. Lip sync with the default English VO is excellent, and the facial animation is generally quite pleasing. I wouldn't expect Hellblade 2 levels of performance fidelity, but relative to virtually anything in gaming, it holds up well. The only area where I have to take slight issue with the game's visual presentation comes down to animation, which can look a bit stiff. Mafia's gameplay animations don't feel as natural as other recent big-budget action games I've played, at least when executing complex sequences of actions. But I think any oddities would be easier on the eyes if Mafia had more motion blur. I find a high-quality, low shutter speed motion blur really helps to sell virtual action, and Mafia has very little of the phenomena, both of the per-object and camera-based varieties. Cutscenes do feature somewhat longer motion blur, as well as a simulation of other optical phenomena like shallow depth of field, but during gameplay, the same liberties are absent. For a game like Mafia that is so clearly trying to ape cinematic conventions, I found this decision to be a little odd. Strangely, there's no way to turn off this limited motion blur either, so you're left with a hint of motion blur no matter what you want. It feels like a compromise designed to please no one. Not enough motion blur for players who want a cinematic look, and too much for players who desire pristine motion clarity. It's especially unfortunate because I think Mafia is best played in its 30 FPS quality mode, where the extra apparent fluidity would be appreciated. That's because the quality mode takes a big step up in visual fidelity relative to the performance mode, which are the two visual options available at 60Hz output. The biggest difference between these options is a downgrade in lumen quality. Expect a less shaded, brighter diffuse GI appearance in performance mode, which is possibly a side effect of losing the close distance detail traces present in the quality mode. It's not a catastrophic difference, but the quality mode definitely has markedly richer lighting. Lumen reflections get the axe in performance mode too, leaving Mafia bereft of lighting detail once objects can't be traced in screen space. In some games this would be a really big loss, but Mafia is a very diffuse material heavy game, so it's not usually all that noticeable. There are some more iterative cuts as well, like a reduction in VSM resolution. Volumetric lighting also takes a resolution hit, with chunkier and noisier results in performance mode. In lighting detail, it feels like we've dropped down a settings preset or so here in the PS5 performance mode. Both PS5 modes have a 1440p-like final resolve, upscaled from lower resolutions using a temporal upscaler. Based on the artifact patterns on edges, I think we're looking at Unreal's TSR here, which is pretty standard for console UE5. Internally, the quality mode averages at around 1224p or so, while performance mode is somewhere around 1080p in typical scenes. Quality mode aims for 30 FPS and usually achieves it, generally hitting that 33 millisecond target. Exceptions are typically minor. You might see a few dropped frames during a sequence, like this high-speed chase in Chapter 4. Cutscenes also drop 1 to 3 frames on camera cuts, which is something we often see in Unreal Engine games. Driving through this coastal town produces the rockiest frame time turbulence, with a steady procession of dropped frames. In general though, this mode feels fine, if a little less stable than we're used to seeing for most current Gen 30 FPS software. Performance mode targets 60, and it's markedly less successful. Solid sections of gameplay do play back at 60 FPS, with absent or minor dips. But more intense traversal-rich sequences hold us in the 40s or even the 30s. Cutscenes also continue to play back at 30 FPS, with dips on camera cuts. There's 2 extra visual modes, which are only available at 120Hz with VRR turned on. There are no additional modes available from just turning on 120Hz output. You need to pair it with a VRR for these options to emerge. The first is an updated quality mode, which seems to target 40 FPS instead of 30 FPS. This packs a visual feature set close to the 60Hz quality mode, so I'm guessing the extra GPU margin comes from more aggressive dynamic res, though it's hard to count owing to capture limitations. This mode usually reaches 40 FPS, but can drop lower, which is why I think VRR is a requirement here. My monitor usually reads 120Hz, but that just corresponds to an internal frame rate that is typically at 40 FPS. Hitches and small frame rate drops are relatively common, which isn't ideal. The second mode is a different spin on the performance mode, which targets an unlocked frame rate that can venture above 60 FPS. Given how shaky this runs normally, I think the frame rate unlocking is a little silly, at least in the here and now on current generation PS5 consoles. In typical play, we're usually hovering around 60 FPS, which makes it feel kind of superfluous. Settings-wise, it seems close to the 60Hz performance mode. Finally, Mafia packs a VSync toggle, which lets you pick between a locked frame rate with VSync and unlocked without. This is a baffling option that probably shouldn't be exposed to console players in any circumstance. It's an especially odd selection for a game like Mafia, which sees relatively little benefit from rapid input response or a faster pace of frames. I'm going to run through the other console platforms fairly quickly because I think we've covered most of the game's key characteristics through the PS5 release. PS5 Pro is perhaps the most interesting of the remaining consoles. In performance mode, we get the benefit of ray-traced lumen reflections now, which gives us proper specular detail when out of screen space. There's also some additional foliage coverage, which you should be able to notice as I flip back and forth here. But the quality of the software Lumen diffuse GI is the same as in performance mode, and that also means that the quality of Lumen reflections is also compromised somewhat compared to the PS5 quality mode, with a less complete scene representation to trace against. In this reflection, there's no roof on the market stalls, for instance. The PS5 Pro has similar internal resolutions to PS5, coming in around 1080p, and it has a similar output res as well. Frame rates are similar to the PS5 performance mode, except that the cutscenes aren't capped to 30 FPS. This seems unintentional because every other platform, including PC, ships with 30 FPS cutscenes. These scenes run mostly at 60 FPS on PS5 Pro, but can suffer from prolonged dips and heavier moments, and typically drop frames on camera cuts as well. In quality mode, the PS5 and Pro look very similar. The biggest visual improvement is the bump to foliage density, just like we find in the performance mode. Resolutions, both input and output, seem similar to the PS5 quality mode, and the framerate target remains at 30 FPS at 60Hz output. Generally speaking, we're close to the PS5 in framerate terms too, with minor drops in similar spots, though PS5 Pro tends to do a better job of sticking to its 30 FPS target. I did notice some 16.7 millisecond frames peppered into some of the PS5 Pro capture as well though, even without corresponding framerate drops. Series X, predictably, is similar to PS5. Both of the visual modes here at 60Hz output are basically identical, with matching settings, similarly sharp output imagery, and similar internal resolutions. There's little to distinguish them, at least at a glance. The Series X quality mode is also more or less a match in performance for PS5, with perhaps slightly better frame rates on the whole. But the performance mode seems to operate at a substantially better clip in moments that appear more GPU limited, like parts of this chase sequence. CPU limited excursions beneath 60 FPS still hit pretty hard, however. Series S, predictably, has only one mode, which targets 30 FPS. Compared to the Series X performance mode, Lumen is cut back somewhat here, with a less pleasing depiction of shade around objects. Foliage is reduced in density, and much of the greenery that remains no longer animates. Certain textures, like the grime patterns on this wall, appear to be absent. Plus, the output looks softer, though internal resolutions are pretty similar. Distant structures are also considerably simplified, and there's more pop-in. I suspect the game may be streaming assets more conservatively, presumably owing to RAM limitations. We don't usually find these kinds of asset downgrades on Series S versions of UE5 games, but Mafia's open-world structure might be putting unique pressures on the RAM-starved junior console. Performance at least is quite good. The game's 30 FPS target is typically met at 60Hz output, with few drops. Our most CPU-heavy stress test, this drive through a coastal town, even proceeds without any frame time incidents. This is probably the most stable of the console 30 FPS modes. The other consoles also have 120Hz VRR modes. The PS5 Pro packs a 40 FPS targeting quality mode and an unlocked performance mode, just like PS5. Series S has no VRR modes, however, keeping its 30 FPS target even at 120Hz output with VRR. Series X is a little weird. The performance mode does operate unlocked, like the other consoles, but the quality mode stays at a 30 FPS target even at 120Hz output with VRR. This may be unintended given the presence of a 40 FPS quality mode on the PS5 and Pro. Overall, I'm basically fine with the run of play on the other three current gen home consoles. Series X is similar to PS5 but with better performance, PS5 Pro is similar to PS5 but with better quality settings, and Series S is markedly inferior to all other consoles, with no mode selection and substantially downgraded settings. There are some weird issues here. The Series X framerate advantage can be unusually high relative to PS5. The PS5 Pro's 60 FPS cutscenes feel like a bug, and there's no 40 FPS modes on Xbox whatsoever. But nothing is particularly offensive. That's just the run of play on consoles though, as other outlets have suggested more substantial burdens with the PC release. I don't have time to do the PC version any kind of justice, but I'd suggest that if you are concerned, the console releases are mostly fine. It's a heavy game for these aging machines, but for a cinematic sort of title, I think image quality and performance are acceptable, especially given the superb graphical fidelity on display. Mafia: The Old Country is structured unlike most modern major releases. AAA one-upmanship has produced a world where big-budget games almost invariably demand 30-plus hour runtimes, vast troves of side content, or extensive multiplayer offerings. Mafia clocks in at something like 10 or 12 hours in comparison, with little side content, no multiplayer, and little replay value. It's an open world game, but its open world lacks side quests or other significant activities, and it has only basic NPC behavior and a static time of day. The asking price has been reduced slightly to compensate at $50 US instead of the customary $60 to $70 price tag modern software often demands. But it's still a break from gaming conventions. I hope that people will take to this kind of model again, the kind of more limited game offering that was pretty common 10 or 20 years ago. In part, that comes down to scalability. A game like Mafia, with 12 hours of main game content, is a lot easier to produce than some 60-hour epic. But that also relates to visual fidelity across that game content. It's not a coincidence that some of the premier visual experiences over the last 10 years, like Hellblade 2, The Order 1886, and Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, have also been shorter, single-player affairs. I think Mafia is fairly successful, judged within those constraints. Some of the experience does feel a little inflexible as non-combat gameplay segments are fairly guided, with little actual player agency. I don't think the stealth is anything to write home about either, and shooting can feel a little wonky. But if you're looking for something a bit GTA-like and very story-driven, I think The Old Country is a good choice. The visuals are a huge part of this game's appeal, but that isn't a bad thing. So I do think that Mafia: The Old Country is a game worth playing. This is an enjoyable romp that's also a stunning UE5 showcase. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, use social media. Thanks for watching.